Hi, friends. My name is Doug Reeves, and welcome to a webinar on Fearless Schools, Achieving Equity and Excellence for Every Student. I'm really pleased to be joined by a couple of my colleagues this afternoon who we'll introduce in just a moment. But I wanted to kind of lay the groundwork for why these topics are so important and deeply intertwined. The new book, Fearless Schools, is all about psychological safety. The bottom line is, when people are afraid, they can't learn. When kids are afraid, they can't learn. When adults are afraid, they can't learn. And over the last 2 years, I think we have to acknowledge that there's a lot of fear in schools. And as a result, one of the most important things we can do if we're to advance the cause of educational excellence is to, first of all, make sure that we have a fearless environment. Now, how do you know that you have a fearless environment? The bottom line is that a fearless environment in a school is a safe place to make mistakes. And that means kids can make mistakes. You see this, of course, in kindergarten and first grade classes all the time. They're not shamed by making a mistake. They're joyful about it. Their teachers use equity sticks. They call on kids who don't know the right answer, followed by not embarrassment or shame, but followed by giggles and learning and kids helping each other out. That's the kind of fearless environment we need in every single classroom, K through 12. And I worry that sometimes in too many classrooms, the only thing you see is hands raised. The only answers that are affirmed are right answers, when the truth is, if they already knew the material, that's not learning. When you walk into a classroom and you see a student make a mistake in a safe environment, then learning is really happening. When you see a teacher linger with a student to stay with them when they make a mistake and say, it's okay, you can answer a question with a question. You can phone a friend. You can give me a partial answer. But what you can't do is check out, because everybody in this classroom stays engaged. The same is true in staff meetings and professional learning meetings. We want to make it a fearless time for the adults as well, where they don't always have to know the right answers. They don't always have to strut their stuff, and they can engage in challenging discussions and debate. They can have wrong answers. They can change their mind. We know one of our colleagues, Dr. Mike Wasta, who's a former superintendent, who used to send out oopsgrams saying, here's the 3 biggest bloopers I made last month and how we can all learn from them. So the bottom line, colleagues, on a fearless school is it's a safe place for both students and adults to make mistakes. And the next time you're visiting a classroom, please don't look for one kid showing off whose hand is always in the air. Look for teachers who use equity sticks. Look for kids who, without any emotional trauma, are able to make a wrong answer, get support, and know that they learned in the course of that. You want to know where you can really get a lift in your step? Start observing a chorus class or an instrumental music class. Colleagues, I guarantee you're going to hear some wrong notes, but they don't leave. The teachers give them immediate feedback, higher, lower, louder, softer, faster, slower. And in a 15-minute observations, you'll hear those young musicians get better and better and better. I want to have a math class that I teach be as good as a music teacher's class, because you see kids get better and better as a result of feedback. Now, that's our kind of first big topic of psychological safety. The second big topic is equity and excellence. And I am fully aware that in many parts of the country, equity has become a controversial term. So here is the way that I approach this. And I think you might consider this in your conversations with parents, with board members, with community constituents. I don't just talk about equity alone, because for too many people, equity is a code word for low expectations. I don't talk about excellence alone, because for too many people, that's a code word for exclusion. Equity and excellence always go together. And it's up to us to make the point that equity is not just, Doug feeling sorry for underperforming kids. Equity helps everybody, as we're going to learn today. Equity is as much for your struggling third grade reader as it is for your valedictorian. Equity helps every student. And in education, we have to do a much better job of defining what equity means and what excellence means, opening the gates for all to participate. Now, before I introduce my colleagues, let me just synthesize some research that I did in the book, Achieving Equity and Excellence. Many of you know my previous research on the 90-90-90 schools, success in high poverty schools. Well, I updated all of that, not just with my research, but amplified by work by wonderful scholars like Heather Zadofsky, Karen Chenoweth, who has a 5-book series that's being done with Harvard Ed Press, Stephen Graham on the value of nonfiction writing. You'll see 100 or more references in there. So this is not just me in the wilderness anymore. It is really the preponderance of the evidence. And what you can have confidence in doing as we think about equity and excellence is knowing that it's not a 5-year Stalinist plan. It's not a bunch of different things on which you have to focus. They're just a few key ideas that we can get done. The first is focus. And the evidence strongly suggests that you can't have more than about 6 priorities. And yet, colleagues, thanks in many cases to the federal funds coming in, I've been in schools that have dozens of priorities, districts that have scores of priorities, and the bottom line is they're not getting implemented. Focus on 6 or fewer things, implement them deeply. That's the key to improve student results. So focus is the first core competency of equity and excellent schools. The second core competency is feedback. Feedback specifically that is accurate and fair. Everybody's going way off the rails on grading systems, and it's alienated a lot of parents and teachers. Just make it simple. I don't care whether you use A, B, C, D, F, 4, 3, 2, 1. That doesn't matter. What matters is the feedback accurate and fair? And I think there's some very specific things we can do when it comes to giving students feedback, much like music teachers do, much like coaches do, that provides feedback that is accurate, that is fair, that is timely. That's the sort of thing that we need. And by the way, colleagues, that's not just for kids. We need to do a better job of providing feedback to teachers, because some of these crazy multi-page observation instruments are burying teachers in minutia that they're just not using. They're more evaluative than they are coaching, and we got to do a better job for feedback for teachers. And what about administrators? I did a large-scale study that essentially found that for the brand new administrative intern, we do a pretty good job for feedback. But for the veteran administrator, the higher they get in rank, the longer their tenure, the more ambiguous and infrequent their feedback is. So we got to have focus, we got to have feedback. The third core competency is effective instruction. And the only way we're going to get that, given the avalanche of new teachers we have coming into our profession, is to do less evaluation and more coaching. Because I've never seen anybody get evaluated into better teaching. I've seen a lot of people get coached into better teaching. And a couple of ideas you might want to consider is that coaching ought to be direct, ought to be face-to-face, ought to be objective. And I get it down to 1 page. So it's really easy for people to understand what the expectations of the observer are. The fourth core competency is leadership. And we can't have great classroom teachers if we don't also have great leaders. I know all of you know the research that the #1 predictor of student success is the effectiveness of the classroom teacher. And that's sure enough true. But the Wallace Foundation recently also said the key to keeping those effective teachers in our schools, and we're losing a boatload of them, the key to keeping them in our schools is great leaders. The Gallup organization shows that people don't quit jobs, they quit their manager. And it's so important that we help our leaders at the building and district level be the most effective leaders that they can be. And finally, the fifth core competency is efficacy. By efficacy, I mean the bone deep belief that we matter. In a big study of more than 2,000 school plans, I studied 3 years of gains and losses in student achievement. Efficacy came out #1. And as I'm sure you're aware, other scholars have found efficacy to be very valuable. The key is, how do we get it? And one of the things that we have to do when it comes to efficacy is not just talk about it, not just have inspirational speeches about it, but to, in fact, demonstrate that we focus our energies on those elements that we can influence and control. And I see way too many faculties perseverating about factors that they cannot influence or control. It's a waste of time. Efficacy is the bone deep belief that I have the power to influence the action, and I'm going to focus on those factors that I control. So that's it. The 5 core competencies of equity and excellent schools: focus, feedback, instruction, leadership, and efficacy. Now, as we go into our discussion period, I'm going to introduce our Executive Director of Professional Learning, Lisa Almeida. Lisa's a veteran administrator at both the district and school levels. She's a veteran urban principal, has also been a classroom educator, and for 20 years, she's been a national leader in professional learning. In fact, at Creative Leadership Solutions, is responsible for the 50-some professional developers who serve schools throughout the nation. We serve schools in 50 states, more than 40 countries, and Lisa's leadership on that has been key to making that effective. And Lisa, we're so happy to have you here today. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you, Doug. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Cedrick Gray, who's our newest one of our newest colleagues here at Creative Leadership Solutions. Simon Sinek says, if you have the opportunity to do amazing things in your life, bring someone with you. So fortunately, Dr. Gray has joined Creative Leadership Solutions full-time as of this week. Cedrick is a former principal, superintendent, and director of education for Shelby County government, where he advised Mayor Lee Harris on policy and reform efforts related to education in Shelby County. He led several successful policy initiatives, including the county's first ever joint ordinance with the city of Memphis to provide universal needs-based pre-K. Established the county's first ever virtual learning academy for students of county employees, and created a vocational education program for high school students. It is my honor to call Cedrick a friend as well as a colleague. Cedrick?
So happy to be here, and thank you all for joining us today. We're just excited about this work going forward, and hopeful that you will be able to walk away from this with something that will help improve the outcomes of the kids and families in your schools.
Well, Dr. Gray, it's such a pleasure to have you here, and I want to tap into your wisdom in just a second and ask you, in your leadership experience, where you've seen a fearless environment and what we can learn from that. And before we do, I just want to say to all of our webinar participants, please don't wait for the end for Q&A. If you've got a question or a comment, please put it in the chat room, or if you prefer, you can use the raise hand function and then unmute yourself. We welcome your participation. So Dr. Gray, let's start with your experience. Where have you seen a fearless environment?
Thank you, Dr. Reeves. And just for the benefit of those who are watching our webinar today, Dr. Reeves and I did not talk about the bow tie selection ahead of time. We just kind of on the same page with that today. So I'll dial back a little bit to where I was assigned as an assistant principal at a middle school here in the Memphis area where I am from. It was what we called an optional school. Nationally and internationally, we call those magnet schools. And there were 600 students in that optional or magnet school, 400 of which were there by application, but 200 students were part of the building, but not necessarily part of the optional program. So they were students that were taking traditional classes. Well, where the fearlessness came in is the principal and I sat down and talked about how we can better improve outcomes for all of our students. And so what essentially ended up happening is we had one class, or the students who were taking traditional classes would take one class from one of the teachers who taught the optional program. It was phenomenal. It was risk-taking. It was a little scary at first as well. But what we discovered was, Dr. Reeves, that the performance of both sets of students began to rise. The students in the optional program who weren't exposed to anything but the optional program actually started functioning at a higher level as well, because there was some collaboration between the teachers in the optional program and the teachers in the traditional program. But more phenomenally, as you can probably imagine, the students in the traditional program success soared above expectations, so much so that there was recognition not only in our school system, but in the state as well. It spoke directly to what you talked about in Fearless Schools, Dr. Reeves, and this trust factor. The teachers began to build a level of trust, not only with the administration, myself and the principal, but also with their students, the ones that they taught regularly in the optional program, and additionally to the ones that they taught in a traditional program. So students walked away from that with this exposure that they wouldn't have otherwise had, but more importantly, because they were matriculating from middle school to high school, they were better prepared when they arrived on high school campuses. Fearless leadership demonstrated in that opportunity.
You know, what your example reminds me of is what Rick Dufour used to say about one of the core elements of a professional learning community. And a lot of people think about it's just the 4 questions. What do we want kids to learn? How do we know if they've learned it? What do we do if they don't? What do we do if they have? But the overarching principle that Rick feared was oftentimes lost was what he called collective responsibility for all kids, not my program versus your program, my department versus your department, but everybody bears responsibility for all students. Cedrick, you said that at first there was some fear. Tell us, how did you win teachers over to, because sometimes that probably happened before you saw the great results.
It's exactly what it was, Dr. Reeves. It was, so we didn't necessarily achieve this buy-in immediately. I think you speak about that as well. We dove both feet in first. We had a kumbaya moment with the teachers that said, we're having this huge gap that's emerging in one building, and all kids deserve the best of what we can provide for them. So those who are performing at an optional school level are leaving our young other students by leaps and bounds. So what are we going to do about it? And so it literally was a time and space where the principal and assistant principal and myself met one-on-one with the teachers to have this conversation about what we wanted to do. And then we did it. It was action research at its finest, really. So we built a master schedule to reflect 4 classes for optional teachers plus the 1 traditional set. And then we watched the numbers. So every 9 weeks, we would review the data. And by the time we got to the end of the third 9 weeks, we saw that the students in the traditional program were beginning to perform better and better. And the summative assessment that was taken, the state test that was taken by the end of that school year, bore those out. But it was literally, let's dive in first, and then we watch the numbers, and then the buy-in. I like to call it at that point, not just buy-in, but really empowerment. The teachers felt a sense of empowerment. They said, I know that if I change my practice this way, this is going to happen. And so that's how they were essentially convinced, more or less. They just took the program over from there.
You've made such a critically important point, because a lot of people still think, well, we can't do change until we have buy-in from everybody. And friends, if you wait for buy-in from everybody, you'll never have change. The sequence that Dr. Gray just articulated, you do it, you observe the results, and then people buy in. That's the most effective change model. And I fear that far too many people are reluctant to do that, and then they wonder why change never happens. Mm-hmm. Well, I want to ask you about the kind of the flip side. I'm sure you've also been in situations where you've noticed barriers to equity and excellence and barriers to creating a fearless environment. What have you noticed those most important barriers are, and how can we overcome them?
Well, so this is where I reflect a little bit on my time as school superintendent. What we recognized were 2 types of barriers. One was a policy barrier, right? Sometimes our school board policies limit the creativity of our principals and principal supervisors by doing things such as not allowing a certain broad stroke for a school day. So if the school day, the state's policies also govern that as well, but the school day is restricted to 8 to 3:30, then we can't necessarily serve the students who would be better served maybe an after school program or before school program. So that proved to be, policy, you have to really be careful about it. But policy itself can be a restrictor or a barrier. The second one that I noticed, again from the superintendent seat, was alignment. So we would have pockets of success, right? Even in schools or classrooms within schools, but there was no reflection on leadership from the district level. And so once though we established that there was one goal for everyone, right? We established wildly important goals in academics. We wanted every student across the district to achieve a certain level by a certain time. That alignment remove those barriers. But sometimes if there's just this great school over here and everybody's running over to that great school to see what that great school is doing, then you're not using the strengths and resources within your own building, which you really should, right? So the alignment piece was a barrier as well.
When you mentioned policy, there are prevailing policies at state and local levels that drive me crazy. 2 that particularly hurt during COVID was if you have 10 absences, then you automatically fail. There wasn't a child in America in the fall of 2020 that didn't have 10 absences. And it was just ridiculous to have that automatic failure, which of course discouraged kids, led to escalating failure and ultimately dropout rates. We got to, as you say, give administrators and educators the liberty to evaluate students the way the country is supposed to have been doing it for more than 20 years. Are they proficient at a state standard? And if they were, it doesn't make any difference whether they had 5 absences or 15. Right. These automatic failures. And the other one that is really on my mind now is if your academic achievement is low, you get kicked out of extracurricular activities. Yes. Well, the evidence says it's exactly backwards. The kids who do get involved in extracurricular activities, particularly those disengaged kids who had no club, no sport, no music, no nothing, get them involved in 1 or 2, And it's a significant increase in behavior, in attendance, and GPA. We ought
Yes.
to be saying, hey, having trouble in algebra? Welcome to the basketball team. Having trouble in English? Welcome to the drama club. And getting
Absolutely.
every kid involved in those things. We really have to challenge those automated policies and trust our leaders much more. I wonder what other barriers you've seen on the psychological safety issue to fearlessness.
So psychologically safe. So this, I'm going to kind of connect the dot between what I was just thinking about, something you just said. One other policy that was a little frustrating for school principals and superintendents was this gateway exam that's been created across our country. I'm not familiar. I'm not sure how many of our listeners are familiar with that, but I know in the state of Mississippi and Tennessee, there is a third grade gate exam that if you don't pass this third grade test, then you won't be promoted to the fourth grade. A lot of these are erected without supplemental support structures in place, which is an automatic no-go for many of our third graders. But it is also a psychological barrier for our teachers, right? So those who are teaching these young people really need the freedom to be able to expand the way they look at grading in their classrooms, need to expand the way they look at providing additional supports, and then the use of before and after school programs as well. But the psychological piece that's surrounding that is limiting. One last thing I'll point out, I had a conversation with a teacher about 2 months ago about efficacy. You mentioned that a little earlier, that when we were going through the pandemic, a lot of our emphasis, once we were emerging from that period in our schools, was to care and give and care for our students. But the teachers literally were saying, what about me? All right. So I have also endured a lot of hardship. I've also endured a lot of challenges. And so the psychological piece was so principals now at that point began to install pieces in their schools that highlighted and celebrated the small accomplishments of teachers, which would help them get quick wins. So such little things like every month there was a birthday party. At the end of the last meeting of the month, there was a birthday cake. There was, white wine, which was grape juice, and just a little celebration to say, hey, it's Lisa and Doug's birthday, so let's celebrate today. And so what that did, it began to pour back into the teachers some degree of, look, I matter, and so what I do matters. So that's an amazing feat I've seen several principals take on, even personally as a superintendent of 60 schools and 30,000 students. There were a couple of thousand teachers. I did a birthday card for each one of them. So it was an overwhelming task at some point, doing up to 200 every month. However, I would go visit the classrooms and see the birthday card sitting on their desk or on their bulletin board, just as a way to lift their spirits. So teachers need to be fed, they need to be encouraged, they need to be supported, and we are responsible for doing that. And that creates a psychological freedom for them to say, I'm going to take this risk. I'm going to do this because I know what's best for our kids, and our administrators support it.
I'm smiling so broadly because you're reminding me of some school observations I did last year and this year. They got precisely to that, the intersection of teacher emotional support and efficacy. And what these principals did was they said, you can choose how you want to do this, but let's take writing as an example, because my research, nonfiction writing is the bomb. It's one of the highest leverage activities we have, helps math, helps science, helps social studies. So, but a lot of people are reluctant to have kids do writing because it's so terrible. So she capitalized on that and saved that fragmentary, hard to read, disjointed writing from September. And throughout the year, had this same child to same child comparison. And at the end of the year, we'll just say, here's September, here's December, here's May. It'll make you weep. The writing got more elaborate. It got more complex, from a few fragmentary sentences to paragraphs. And these are elementary kids. I've seen the same thing, by the way, done at middle and high school. And when it comes to efficacy, do I matter? Do I make a difference? And you look at that display, same kid, same teacher, same family, same nutrition, same absence, same everything. And we can say to the teachers, so what made the difference? It was you.
That's it.
All the other variables are the same. You, the classroom teacher, made that difference. And I just thought the principals who did that are just brilliant. And I've seen similar things done on everything from math problem solving to lab reports. Display the work and don't throw away the old stuff, because
Right.
part of what makes efficacy happen is knowing, oh my goodness, look at where they were before, look at where they are now. We made that difference. That's really good.
That's it.
You said something else, Cedric, that I think is really important about the vision. When it comes to change, you created obviously a very positive vision of the future that empowered people. I think one of the things we need to think is also, what's the vision if we fail to change? Because I think people think, well, gee, change is risky and difficult. If we don't change, that's just the easy road. And on the contrary, failure to change is a terrible vision of the future, including high DF rates, high failure rates, and ultimately high dropout rates. And when we look at those things, that is not a 2022 problem. That is a 2062 problem, because we are going to have decades of unemployment and poverty and medical care costs, criminal justice costs, if we lose these kids. So that negative vision is just as compelling as the positive one that you create. Now, I want to ask a different question, if you don't mind, and I want to invite our audience. If you've got comments or questions you want to place in the chat room, please do so. We'll stop what we're doing and make sure that we listen to you. And remember, as always, those of you who know me know that challenges are also appropriate. If you were a student in a graduate seminar, I'd assign half of you to say, Doug's crazy and wrong, because we learn from divergent thinking. So I want you to know your challenges are always going to be respected and appreciated. And I got an ulterior motive, I'll tell you, when I invite challenges, because our kids need to see adults who disagree with each other and are still friends. So it's always going to be okay to disagree with Dr. Gray or myself.
Absolutely.
Now, here's a different question, and it is about what happens inadvertently. You know, I think teachers have got big hearts, and administrators do. God bless them for being in our profession, for staying in our profession after the last 2 years, after so many left. But I'll bet you've seen some things that people do, and they're educated professionals, they're thoughtful people, so it's inadvertent. But inadvertently, it still leads to a decline in psychological safety and equity and excellence. What are some things that you've seen that are not on purpose, they're not malicious, but they still have a devastating effect?
Yeah, so this one, this really relates more to the students. A little story, if I may. When I was in Jackson, we were faced with trying to determine how to best handle cell phones. So the kids had them. Do we prohibit them? How do we handle these? And so what I've seen we launched into was making decisions for the students without their voice. And that had a tremendous impact on us a little later. So what we ultimately ended up doing, and I'm speaking directly to, how can we fix these things that we are breaking? So in that, what we did was we created a student board of trustees, literally, and their assignment was to help us resolve this cell phone issue. They came up with the first cell phone policy right there in the middle of little old Jackson, Mississippi. I think one of the things that we're making a mistake of is not including all voices at the table when all voices at the table are impacted by our decisions. And so, youth is the students is they were just one factor in that. But you can look across the board to all of this. I've made the mistake myself as a superintendent, not including and not thinking through teachers and principals when we're making decisions about what happens in school buildings. So, but that I think if we're not careful and not to include more voices where they are appropriate, then we're going to end up making mistakes that we'll have to go back and fix at another time. Yep.
Yeah. I see, very similar things. And again, there's no blame here. But
Right.
what we often do as teachers is we want to, because our teachers, they're college educated professionals, lucky to have them. And what they assume is what made them successful is what will make today's students successful. And the two areas where that comes out is they want to have grading policies that worked for them 20 years ago, also today. And it's clearly not working. Most grading policies are deeply toxic, including things like the use of the average, which punishes kids for mistakes they made 3 months ago. And the same is true of homework. Hey, our classroom teachers, they were great students. They graduated from college and became teachers, and they did their homework. But it's not working for a lot of kids today. Some kids do go home to great internet connectivity and a lovely private place and supportive parents and all that sort of stuff. And
Right.
other kids go home to chaos and sibling care and food preparation and jobs. And they're not doing homework does not mean they've got a character flaw. It means their lives are a little complex. And so I just think we have to relentlessly say, even though things might have worked well for us 20 or 30 years ago, is it working today? And we got to constantly ask the question, and if it's not working, what are some constructive alternatives rather than continue to beat our heads against the wall? But I want to be clear, when things go wrong, I only in a tiny fraction of instances is there really malice where people just don't like kids. I think for the most part, every teacher wants kids to be successful. We're just struggling to figure out how can we get that done.
Agreed.
Yeah. I'm wondering also if you could pick one or two levers that you would recommend to the people on this call, not, as I said, the 5-year plan, but every time we're involved in professional learning, people want to know something. So, Dr. Gray, what can I do tomorrow to make one step forward? What are some counsel that you'd offer to teachers and administrators on this webinar?
I'll just speak from my personal experience. As a school leader, the principal oftentimes may not know. So I came from a reading and social studies background. So when I became a principal and had to observe math and science, I felt like I was at a deficit. Until I started to examine my first recommendation, examining instructional strategies that are high impact. Those work in every classroom, right? So there are lots of ways to approach this. The way I did it was I reviewed standards before I walked into a classroom. So when I walked in there and I saw third graders doing a certain thing, it matched the third grade standard we expected them to learn. The second thing is, especially as a principal and or maybe a principal supervisor or a district leader, is to continue to review the practices of your professional learning communities. And so that is reviewing student work, identifying any misconceptions, and then leaning into how to improve instruction around those misconceptions. The third thing is literally, and very frequently, especially if you're a school principal, have constant conversation with the school leadership team in your building about things that need to improve. This can be what I would call create this the cadence of accountability. And so we know the 4 questions we ask in PLCs. I would develop the similar set of questions to that when principals meeting with its instructional leadership team. What are the things that we want our students to know and understand and be able to do? How do we know when they've learned it? What do we do if they have not? And then what do we do when they have? But ask those questions on a leadership level. So ask those questions of your teachers, ask those questions of your school operations and practices, and then move forward from there. But do so always with a collaborative ear, right? So one person doesn't run the entire building. I know you may be in charge, but you're not always in control. So just think about it from that way. Just thinking about how you can collaboratively move forward in your school, in school leadership. And I know that we're talking to a mixed group today. I know there's teachers and principals. And so if you're a teacher online or you're a teacher leader online, one day you'll aspire to be in the principal's seat. You could take that information with you. But I think the most important thing is to just have a good ear on the teaching and learning that's going on in your school.
And if I could just add an exclamation point, professional learning communities are clearly one of the highest leverage activities, if and only if we do them right.
That's
and I
right.
see a lot of PLCs get bogged down. The last article that Rick Dufour wrote before he passed away, he co-wrote with me, and it was called The Futility of PLC Light. And there's a lot of PLC light going on. And so we have to listen carefully to what Dr. Gray said. If we're not focused on the 4 questions, learning, assessment, support, enrichment, I've seen a lot of them be nothing but another faculty meeting, and that's a waste of time. And the good news is they can save time when they're done right. When we collaboratively score, when we hone in on exactly what students need to learn, it saves classroom time and saves teacher time. So I know sometimes people will say, oh, gee, who has time for a PLC meeting? If you do them right, it saves you hours in the classroom and is really great. I just chip in for whatever it's worth, what I think some of the high leverage activities that our participants might consider. One that I'm really focused on right now is getting 100% engagement. And the way you get 100% student engagement is to stop the practice of only calling on kids whose hands are raised. What that does is has reliable Maria answering every question, and everybody else in the class can check out. And when the principal comes to watch, they can pretend like they're paying attention, but there's only 10% engagement in the classroom. If we aspire to 100% engagement, we got to do what primary teachers do, and that's use equity sticks. And they're called equity sticks for a reason, because that way every single student has an equal probability of being called on. And as the grade level gets higher, particularly into middle and high school, what happens is we call on the kids who least need feedback from the teacher, because they already know the stuff.
Sure.
Teacher feedback is one of the most powerful things that we provide. And if we deny that to our EL students, we deny that to our students who are not prepared, and we're afraid, we've created this fearful environment. If they don't know the answer, they might have a meltdown. No, if they don't know the answer, let's have some learning take place. And I don't think you ought to settle for anything less than 100% engagement. If you don't like equity sticks, there's plenty of other ways to randomly call on students, and you can make it safe for them, emotionally safe. You can phone a friend. You can answer a question with a question. You can give me a partial answer. But what you can't do is check out in my class. We got to have 100% engagement. And it's interesting to me, our music classes have 100% engagement. Our athletic practices have 100% engagement, where people are getting immediate feedback. I think we ought to have every class and every subject aspire to that. I just add one other high leverage activity. If you want to take away one idea from today to apply tomorrow, it's to disable the automatic use of the average. I mentioned the average before, but I got to tell you, you don't need a 20-page grading policy. You don't need a 5-year Stalinist plan. You just need to do one thing: stop using the average. And I'll tell you why, colleagues, because we spent a boatload of time and money in the last 2 years on social and emotional learning. Everybody will raise their hands. 3 cheers for resilience, 3 cheers for perseverance. Everybody believes in that. But you can't say, I believe in social and emotional learning, resilience and perseverance, and then turn around and use the average and punish kids for mistakes of 3 months ago. Because that just says, well, shoot, I don't care how resilient you are, kid, I'm still going to punish you. And everywhere I go, I see students who are proficient at the state standard, and yet they are failing a class because of missing work from 3 months ago. It's just plain crazy. So we're not giving you a big laundry list, but what you heard from Dr. Gray and me, if you apply a couple of those things, you can do that tomorrow and make a difference. Lisa, do we have some comments or questions in the chat room?
No, we don't, but we're a small enough group that I invited folks, if they have challenges, successes, or questions, to go ahead and unmute. If you'd like to turn on your camera and just open it up to Dr. Reeves or Dr. Gray for questions or comments.
We'd welcome that. Just have a few minutes left. Well, I'm not going to use equity sticks today, but next time you're in a seminar of mine, maybe I will. I'll pull your name out of a hat. I just want to express my appreciation for the fact that our participants took time to participate in this webinar. I know how incredibly busy everybody is, and the fact that you're willing to commit to professional learning is really important. And I'll just say why, and then I'm going to give Dr. Gray the final word. As you know, there's been significant attrition in our teaching and leadership ranks. Most recent survey says 53% of teachers would leave if they could. And I know a lot of you are investing money in improving teacher salary and benefits, and I appreciate that. But I want to tell you, money's not enough. Even with increased salary and benefits, we're still losing people. And the article that I wrote, Restoring the Teacher Profession and the Pipeline, says that in addition to fair pay and benefits, what they need are safety, physical safety, psychological safety. They need respect. They need collaboration. They need professional learning. And if all we do is give them money, but still burn them to a cinder or have them feel unsafe, we're not going to keep them in our profession. So we need to think as leaders and as colleagues, as classroom educators, how do we build not just financial security for people, as after all, you can't have 6-figure debt in 5-figure income, which is what we ask teachers to do, but you got to have psychological safety, you got to have physical safety, you got to have respect, you got to have the opportunity for collaboration and learning. And a lot of collaboration and learning was obliterated in the last 2 years as people were completely isolated, or if they did have time for a meeting, they left the meeting to cover a class. We got to get back to collaboration and learning. It's the only way we're going to restore our profession. Dr. Gray, you get the last word.
Thank you so much, Dr. Reeves. Just thanking everyone for coming. Just really three things real quickly. First of all, I want to say you have just made the difference. You showed up today on behalf of the young people that you are leading. So that's number one. Number two, make a difference, right? So take what you've learned and put it into practice. Even if it's just one thing that you're going to try just one time, you'll see that it's going to make yield huge dividends later. Third is that don't stop here. All right, don't let this be the last time you reach for your own professional learning. You have the drive and initiative, and you want to make things better for the young people that you serve. So be encouraged, and we're grateful for your showing up here. So look forward to more of these, and spread the word. Spread the word, because others need teachers and leaders like you to make an impact in classrooms across our country.
Well, thank you so much, Lisa and Dr. Gray. It's great to have you today, and thanks to all of our colleagues who joined us. By the way, we're making a recording of this webinar. We'll post it, and if you have colleagues who couldn't make it today, we're happy to share it with you so you can share this information with your colleagues. Thanks, everybody, and have a great rest of the day.